Today, we're going to be running through everything that you need to know to get up and running with Zoho Analytics. We're going to cover things like pulling data in, creating reports, creating dashboards, and even displaying and publishing those out to your organization. So with that, let's jump right on in. So here I am inside of Zoho Analytics. I, for example, have a workspace set up already in here. A workspace is kind of like your top layer of organization. Many companies end up only having one where they pull in all of their Zoho data, but you can have multiple. If you don't have one already, the way to create one is up here in the top right under Import Your Data. And this will essentially pull up a big old page that shows all the different data sources that are available. You'll see many Zoho apps as well as non-Zoho apps included within here. So go through, pick the one that makes the most sense and get started. For most Zoho users, it's going to be Zoho CRM. In my case, again, I've already set up that workspace, so we're actually going to jump into that now. Now, inside of a workspace here, over on the left-hand side are kind of your top layers of organization. Interestingly, within this application, I would say you kind of want to start at the bottom. Data sources, then data, then reports, then dashboards. That's kind of the natural order of operations that you're going to follow as you go through and set up Zoho Analytics. Step one here, let's look at data sources. This is pretty critical because if you don't get data in, you're not going to be able to pull any reports. So here I already have one data source set up for Zoho CRM. I'm going to add a new one so that we can go through it step by step, and I'll show you exactly how to do this. So let's go to click on Add Data Sources in the top right. Here, we'll want to go through and pick an application where we know that we have some data. For example, maybe I want to use something like Zoho Books or, the finance suite as a whole. All I need to do is go through and make that selection. Now, the only difference between Zoho Finance and the individual apps is like if you did not want to pull in, let's say, expense data, you would set up syncs individually for those other applications. Generally speaking, though, I just go in and set up finance. So I'm going to do that here. Now, there's just a little pop-up saying, hey, this is what you're going to need to do. Authenticate your Zoho Finance account, select the data that you want, and then you're off to the races. So we'll click Next. We're going to choose which type of organization we need or which organization. You can pull multi-organizations. That's another video for another day. The vast majority of you probably just have the one. So you will see that for some applications. So I'm going to grab my demo account. Next step, we're going to make some choices here about what types of records we want to bring in to Zoho Analytics. And so for different applications, of course, this list is going to look different, but it is going to work exactly the same. So over here on the left are essentially our different modules of data that we can choose to bring in. If I click on one of them, over on the right, I get all the individual fields that are available for that module. So really common one here when I'm pulling in finance data, of course, I want the SKU of all my items, right? I might want the category of all my items. And so I'm scrolling over here on the side and essentially selecting each of those things that I need. To be honest, depending on the amount of data that you have, if you don't have a bunch of custom fields, oftentimes I just go check and I check this box and I bring in everything, right? Because at the end of the day, like I might not need, package width and height right now, but maybe in the future I do. And so it'll just already be there waiting for me. If there are modules as a whole that aren't selected, we can bring those in. So here, let's say we've got inventory adjustments. I'll just check the box over here on the left. That now means that that's going to come in as a data table. And then I can go over to the right and again, select any of the fields or values that I need there. So as I'm going through here, really what I'm looking for is like based on the types of things that I might want to do, what are the fields and modules that are going to be relevant for me? I would always recommend, again, depending on the amount of data you have, the storage limits in analytics are quite high. So when in doubt, bring it in, right? Because it's not going to really hurt you as long as you get comfortable with searching and finding the things that you need so that the clutter doesn't like slow you down or anything. One other little tip here, and I'll show this in detail, you'll see things like expenses and then expense item. If you're pulling in expenses or bills or purchase orders, you pretty much always want the related items as well. Basically, one bill, let's say, would be one row in the bills table. But if it had 3 line items on it, it would have 3 items in the bill item table. So You almost always want to bring in those items if you're going to bring in the parent at all, because without it, it's going to be a lot less useful and you're not really going to be able to know what items have I actually billed for. So now that we've gone through this, I do want to check one more thing here that I will circle back to. I want to make sure we've got our customer data because that will be pretty important and cool. Now down here at the bottom, we can choose how often we want to sync. I normally do the fastest I can, whatever you'll give me, right? So in this case, you might see 3 hours, you might see 2 or 1, just depending on when you signed up. They're kind of rolling out faster syncs across the board. You can choose whether or not you want to create default reports, and then you can choose whether or not you want to automatically connect your CRM data to Zoho Finance. You'll see this on some of the applications. I believe it's the same way for Zoho Desk, where inside of a customer record, inside of Zoho Books, you'll see things like reference ID, CRM reference ID. This basically gives you a way to connect these two records in a really efficient and clean one-to-one match. So I am going to actually enable the blend. I generally do. I think that it's useful, and I think that it allows me to connect up records that are valuable for me. You'll also see things like CRM potential ID here. I normally do check that box. I don't worry about subscriptions in this case. Basically, when you create a quote or an estimate from the CRM using that related list in the deal, that will show up here and allow you to make that connection. So now I'm going to click create, and that's going to run in the background. I'm going to open up CRM real quick here on the side because we're going to jump into that momentarily. This is going to load for a second, so we'll be right back. All right, so that sync is now set up and running in the background. Sometimes these initial fetches are really quick. Sometimes they'll take a little longer. It kind of depends on how much data you have. If you're new to Zoho 1 and you're like setting this up right out of the gate, you can expect it'll go pretty darn quick. Now, before we jump into data, reports, and dashboards, I do want to show, just in case, let's say in the future, you add a new field to something like Zoho CRM and you want to get that added to Zoho Analytics, I can just come in here, click on the data sources, choose the source, go into edit setup here, and then it's going to give me that same exact type of UI going by module and by field to choose what types of things I want to bring in. Now, obviously, this list is different because we're looking at the CRM instead of the finance suite, but all those rules still apply. If I can choose modules, I can choose fields, and I can pull in those specific things that I need without having to reset the whole connection, right? All the data that's already there still is going to be there, but I can add new records as needed whenever I have maybe a new custom module or any new fields. Let's take a look at data real quick. So one thing I want to show here is what the data actually looks like inside of Zoho Analytics. Now, I'm going to click this data tab. You're going to go, overwhelming. Up here at the top, search. I can't say it enough. As you're starting to get your analytics suite configured, create naming conventions, use the search, right? So for us internally, we have certain terms that like must be in certain types of dashboard names and in certain types of reports because it becomes a little overwhelming. It's one piece of feedback that we see around Zoho Analytics pretty often is like, look, there's just so much stuff in here. It's hard to keep track. So I do always recommend using that search tab. Now, let's open up a deal and take a look at the data that exists here inside of Zoho Analytics. There's basically a spreadsheet, right? It's rows and columns. Each row is going to be one deal that I have inside of the CRM, and each column is going to be one field inside of that deal, right? So if we go ahead and grab this example opportunity just for, the kicks here, we'll go into our deals and we'll pull that one up. We can see basically one-to-one for any of the fields that I've chosen to sync, those are going to exist here inside of this table. So I look at like example, this is set as closed one. It looks like I've got two, so it's this one here. This is set as qualification. So boom, there it is. All the other fields will show up. The one thing you might notice is, hey, a deal owner is in my CRM. It says, Zenatta demo or Zenatta admin user. In analytics, it's just a big long string of numbers. Same with something like account name, right? Which would be like a company name in CRM. But over here just looks like a big long string of numbers, right? So what's going on with that? So what that is basically that when we have a record inside of the CRM and we have a lookup field, something like account name, contact name, the record owner, which links to a user, rather than putting that name from analytics' perspective, it's going to put in the ID of that account. So if I were to go to my deal here, and let's say I open up this account in a new tab, we can see this number in the URL, right, ending in 6003. So if I were to come into analytics and see, it's going to be that same number here in row 10 under the account name, right? And what that does is it basically just ensures that as analytics is putting together a report that potentially links two different tables together, it can use this ID rather than the name. Now, you can still use the name when you actually create a report, but the system is going to use an ID to actually make those connections and link up records. Couple more things I will show with the data. So inside of the data, we can add things like formula or aggregate formulas. A formula column would essentially be a way to create some type of, it's almost like an Excel statement. Technically, you write them more like SQL statements, but they'll be pretty familiar to you. So let's say we wanted to do like some type of new date, closing date plus 30 days, let's say. We could come in here and create a new field. We can search through our functions. I'm not going to go through all of these. There are a boatload of functions in here. But so I can come in and do something like an add date. And I can say, hey, give me a new column that is the closing date plus, let's say, 30 days. Now, I do recommend as you get into these, hover over this tooltip and read it. It'll tell you exactly how to use these types of formulas. When I first got started using Zoho and using Zoho Analytics, I would just try these over and over and over and over again until it was correct for all the records. And if you keep doing that, I promise you, you will get really good at working with these formulas. When in doubt, think about it like an Excel formula. The names might be different, but structurally, it's going to look really similar. I will also point out they have examples in here that you can look at in each of the tooltips on like how you would format it and then how it would look. So here, I'm going to add this formula to do 30 days after the closing date. Over here on the right now, we can see that that formula field exists, right? So if we look here, we've got closing date of the May 11th, add 30 days, looks good. So formula fields, really useful. Now you can also do things like aggregate formulas. So something like, let's say you want to look at closed won revenue, something in that regard. Because what you can do is you could make a report, and I'll show you that in a bit, and you could add filters to it. Or you can make more of a universal formula, right? That no matter where you use it, it's going to be useful and it's always going to follow the same rules. So if you hear the bias in my tone there, I love aggregate formulas. I use them all over the place because it allows me to be really consistent. And if I have a formula that I use a lot, I can just reuse it. I don't need to retype it in 10 different places. So a sum if, I use this constantly. Sum if basically is if a certain condition is found to be true. So if stage is closed won, then include amount in a sum. Otherwise, include 0. Up here in the top right, I'll format it as a currency. I'll click save. Now, aggregate formula, not going to show up over here, right? It's not its own column. It's a formula that we're going to invoke later when we go and actually make a report. Before I jump into reports and dashboards, I do want to ask, if you're finding the video useful so far, be sure to like and subscribe down below. Leave me a comment with what you want to see next in analytics. Trying to make this video comprehensive, but I do know we're just scratching the surface here. So let me know if there's more specific things you'd like to see. And last but not least, if you want some help setting this up in your Zoho account, just head on over to Zenatta.com and click on book a meeting. We'd always love to chat. So with that, let's jump into reports. So reports can look a few different ways, right? A report could be something like a chart. It could also be something like a pivot view or a tabular view. Dashboards, they kind of put them in this report and dashboard section, but they are very different. A dashboard is a place that we're going to put multiple reports. So we're going to get to that at the end. Now, let's take a look at just like a basic pivot view. First, you're going to choose your base table, right? This isn't exclusively the only table you're going to use, and I'll show that, but it is an important starting point. So in this case, if I want to make like an open pipeline report, let's say, I'm going to start with my deals table. Now, each of these different types of reports, and I am going to show a chart after this pivot table, are going to function relatively similarly. There'll be minor differences in where you're going to put things, but at the end of the day, pretty similar approach. Over here on the left are all the different pieces of data that we can use, and over here on the right are where we can put those pieces of data. So let's say that we want to create some type of open pipeline report. I'm going to bring in things like deal stage, or deal name. I know I'm going to bring in something like stage. Let's say I want to bring in amount. Those who have been using the system for a while know I did something wrong there, and I'll circle back to that. And then let's say I want to bring in maybe the account name. We might have multiple deals open for one account, so I'll bring in the account name so that I can see what types of companies are in the mix. So I'm going to click on generate. And what we find is that something looks a little off here, right? We used the account name from the deal, right? And remember, that account name in the deal is just a long string of numbers. That's all we got there. So how do we fix that? Well, what you'll notice is over here on the left, I don't just have access to deals data. I have access to all these different types of data that exist inside of my analytics suite that are linked to my deal. One of those is the accounts in CRM. So we're going to get rid of that account name from the deal, and we're going to bring in the account name from the accounts, and we'll see if that looks a little bit better. Well, it sure does, right? Because now we're actually pulling a name, not an ID. And so there are some of those things, I show that to demo, that like you'll see a lot of these reference IDs. And this is something that if you're really used to working in analytics tools, is probably intuitive. And you're like, yeah, dude, I get it. But if you're not, it's not the most obvious thing. That everything behind the scenes is just long numbers that link everything up. And then we display the name. One other thing I might want to adjust here is we'll notice like, yeah, this is cool and all, and I can kind of like take a look at it. Not really loving that these stages are just like randomly sorted, right? Because what it does is it sorts columns from left to right. So like this is alphabetical, deal name is alphabetical. Really, I might want to move stage up to the top here, right? Because in this way, I can actually see where we're at in the process, right? I also notice, well, this isn't quite the right order. So maybe I'll come into the sort section up here and I'll do a custom sort based on the stage. And here it's going through, needs analysis. Okay, cool. Did a good default custom. I'll click on apply. Now it's looking a lot better, right? This is actually moving from one step to the next, right? Qualification, needs analysis, value. It's like, okay, check, check, check. If you're someone at a company who's making reports and you're going to show them to management, make sure you get things like this correct. If you don't have like the sort order set up, they're going to immediately go, I don't want to look at this. A lot of analytics is getting the little details correct. Most of it is simple, but it's that attention to detail that can make something much more useful. What I also notice here is like, well, this isn't really looking like a pivot table, right? It's really just a table because nothing's being summed or aggregated in any way. So what I may want to do is come in, take my amount, rather than putting it here in the rows, maybe I want to put it in the data section. And what we'll notice is that immediately as I move it over, you'll see here it's either treated as a range or treated as a dimension, meaning just put exactly what's in the field. When you move it over here, now there's all these math statements associated to it, like sum and average and median, etc. So now if I move it over, what it will do is it will actually create now summation rows, which is, again, more looking like a pivot table. It does have this tendency of wanting to sum everything based on everything. Now here, sure, maybe in some cases I have multiple deals for one account and I want to see that sum. If I don't want to, I'll just right click here in this cell, like directly in this cell, and then I will unshow those totals. So now I have something that looks a lot better, right? I'm summing within each of my stages, but I'm not double summing each of my accounts over and over and over again and creating, just an infinite amount of sums. So we'll give this a name. We'll save it. We're going to choose where we want to save it. Little pro tip, manage your folders. I see a lot of scenarios where we go into an analytics account that's being used for a while, and every single report and dashboard that's ever been generated in the history of the account lives in Zoho CRM modules. You don't want that. That's just a folder to put the raw data, right? So either create new folders or put them into some of the standard ones that come out of the box with each application. So in my stage here, deals and pipeline reports would make perfect sense for this. So I don't need to create a new one. I'm just going to put it in here. One thing I'll also recommend is if you did set up any of the default reports and dashboards, remember in that data sources, as we're creating a data source for the Zoho Finance Suite, we checked a box and we said, hey, go ahead and create me a bunch of default reports, right? Awesome. Do keep in mind, there's a lot of them. All of these over here on the left that you're seeing are all default reports. I didn't make any of these. Maybe one or two of these over time I've made for like a demo or training activity, but like All of this is just default stuff, which is great because it gives you an awesome starting point. Like this report that we made right here, it exists in here somewhere or a very close analog. And so I do like that. You can come in, you can start with these, you can make adjustments to them. I do honestly recommend starting on like a dashboard level, like go into like, hey, what's our, pipeline history? And then work from these and kind of remove or add. I will say a lot of them need a lot of work when you get them out of the box, but they do give you a good starting point. All that to say, start creating a naming convention. Something like I put the company name at the end, just as a basic example, because none of these default reports are going to have that. And then as a result, I can now search for Zenatta and it will show me only the ones I've created, right? So different tricks are going to work for different people. You can use different naming conventions. The important thing is make a naming convention and then use it so that you can actually find things. One last thing we're noticing here is, this is called open pipeline report. And this stuff is closed, right? We don't really want that in here. So we can go into filters up here at the top. We'll see that there's two types of filters. One of them is just called filters. That I kind of term as like the hard-coded filters. So this is behind the scenes. You're basically including or excluding certain types of records. So in my case here, I'm choosing close lost, close won, and job created. And then I'm just going to check exclude. I don't want these, right? Because this looks okay right now before I have this, if I jump back into the report, like you can see, it's just a small handful of data that I don't need, and it's at the bottom. Think about if you've been running the system for a really long time, right? The majority of deals are going to be close won or close lost, right? Because everything ends eventually. Instead, I'm going to exclude these. Now they're gone just like that. And I have just my open stages that are in the mix. Now, user filters, on the other hand, are basically a way to set up a filter that a user can select at their discretion, right? So this can be a single or multi-select. You can include only certain values if you'd like. In this case, I'm going to include all of them. And you can set a default. In my case, it wouldn't really make sense to. So with that user filter, now if I'm in view mode, like I'm the user actually looking at this, I could be like, you know what, dude, I don't really need to see qualification. That's too early for what I'm looking for. I want to see stuff that's already qualified, right? So I could just remove that, right? And now I'm just seeing the remainder of those deals that meet those filter criteria that I've set up. Last thing I do want to show is a way that things can go horribly wrong, because I do have to show those things. So let's say we want to include the owner on this, right? And I could come in and grab something like, or no, you know what? We're going to do a different user field. I'll talk through this. So inside of the deals, if we go to a deal record here, we've got modified by, we've got created by, we've got deal owner. Now, inside of my report, what you'll see here in the deal section is deal owner, not a perfect example because they do actually give that to us as a text field, right? Like if I wanted to just put that in, it does actually work. And you can see because it's termed as a text field here. But maybe if I wanted to do created by or modified by, what you'll notice is that there are scenarios where one record, a deal, points to another record, a user, in multiple ways. And this is where things can go a little bit awry. So if I were to come in and I were to grab from my users table something like full name, let's say I didn't want to group on it. I just wanted to see it, right? We're going to put full name right in here within each stage. We're going to get rid of the sum because it drives me crazy. And we'll click save. Now, it's got demo 6 user and demo 6 admin, right? What way did it get that, right? Do we know for certain right now how it's getting that? Is it using created by? Is it using modified by? Right? So things aren't always so obvious. Now, the way to check that is this super sneaky little button up here in the top right called paths. And what this does is it basically gives us a way to see and control how links are happening. So for deals to accounts, if I click on configure lookups, I can see, great, it's using that ID field from the deal and the ID from the account. Beautiful. I love it. Now, let's take a look at the users. If I click on the users here, this is using deal owner and pointing to the ID of a user. So what that means is that in here in our report, this field is deal owner. What if I wanted it to be something else, right? In this case, oftentimes you do want it to be owner, but what if I wanted it to be created by? I can come in and change my path. and see if there's another route that I can take to get from where I am to where I want to go. Right now, these get wildly complicated, right? Because it's every different path of IDs that could possibly exist anywhere inside of the system. I normally recommend simple is better if you can. Like there's almost no world where I'd go from a deal to an invoice to a stock to a FIFO to a stock to a bill to a purchase to a project to a customer to an account to a user, right? That wouldn't make a lot of sense. This would be basically the account owner, just in a really roundabout way. So I can come in here and change the path. I can also click here and sometimes change my lookups. Now, what you will notice is that sometimes things get a little bit wonky. Inside of my deal record, for example, what we can see is that if I right-click on deal owner, we have edit lookup information. And if I right-click on, let's see, our created by ID, which must be hidden here. It looks like we just don't have that pulling in. So you will see scenarios where when you click here, there is no lookup configured. In that case, you'll just need to add a lookup, right? And basically configure that a new set of data is going to link and create that pathway for you to use. Now, let's go ahead and create now a chart. So something a bit more visual. So I'm going to do this based on our deal. Click on OK. What type of chart do we want to make here? Maybe we want to make something like a funnel, for example. That's a fun one. Everybody loves a good funnel chart. Now, I'm going to drag stage into my x-axis, and then we'll make a choice. How big do we want each section of the funnel to be? And how do we want to count it? Do we want to see revenue within each funnel step? Do we want to see count of deals within each funnel step? Because I've already showed you running a sum, I'm going to do the count. So if I want to do a count of records, the universal best way to do that is going to be to grab the ID of that record and do a distinct count on that, right? Because each deal ID is only going to show up once. So if I count each deal ID, we know I'm going to have an accurate count. You might be saying, well, why couldn't I use deal name, right? If I use deal name, that should surely be fine, right? Well, not always. Perfect example. Let's say I'm a user and I've done the same deal multiple times over a period of time. Maybe I cloned it, right? And we can see I've got 3 of these deals right here with the exact same name. Well, if I were to have brought in deal name and just done a count on it or a distinct count, my number is going to be wrong because those are not distinct. It can't count them anymore. So I always just use ID and I go to distinct count every single time, no matter what, when I want to count a certain record. Now I'll click on generate. It's just going to guess at a format here. 9 times out of 10, it's going to give you a bar chart or a pie chart. If we want to change what type of report this is, we can click these little 3 dots here and we can see what are all the options that exist. Now, what you'll notice is that the options at the top are going to either be grayed out or they're going to be available based on where you've put certain fields. So something like a stacked bar, it's like, dude, I would love to color code these bars for you. You've not given me anything to use to do that, right? So let's say I wanted to see our, count of deals by each stage, and I also want to see what lead source they came from. If I were to drag that lead source into color, now I can make a stacked bar, right? And I can see within each of these, the height of everything is the same, but it's now been split up into, that lead source specifically. Oh, little visual bug here. Refresh. It's a funky one. Now back to our chart view for our deals. So I'll bring in that ID again. Must have done something weird there. And we'll bring in our stage. And then let's say we want to see one that's a little more realistic. Bring in like deal owner name, right? Again, I can now see within each of these stages who's got what person owns each of those records. Now, if I want to make a funnel, I don't want to have color coding turned on. I just need an X and a Y. I'll click on funnel chart and I'll click on funnel. And now here we can basically see for each of these stages, how many deals are in each of them. Now we might notice, well, it's showing me the percent as this top level. And it's like, yeah, that's cool and all, but like maybe not what I want to see. I can make changes to that. So let's say I wanted to make the size based on the number of deals and the amount that shows here based on the revenue. I could just drag in a sum of amount and boom, it's now popped in these little icons over here to the side. If I want to add any tooltips or kind of identifiers to see more information about each of these, I can definitely do that. So in the tooltip right now, it's showing the amount and the count of the records, just because, again, like those are the things that I've shown so far. If we wanted to do other types of things showing up in there, let's say we want to have like our, sales cycle duration, I could bring that into my tooltip. This is going to look a little funky. The number will be way off, but I can now bring in another parameter and it will show up inside of that section. Now, same thing applies here for charts. I can go into filters. I could look at my stage. I could get rid of these ones here, because I'll tell you, especially in this case, if you're just looking at everything for the history of forever, those are just going to be huge at the bottom, right? Because everything ends up being closed lost or closed won. So I go ahead and exclude that. And then here I now have that cleaned up version. So we'll save this. Again, there's a ton of options in here on how you can make these look and feel. I'll leave that to you to explore. I will also highlight up under the settings. We can change things like the theme, the color coding, etc. I'm not going to worry too much about that just for right now. One thing that you do want to do in here is, if you remember, as I hovered, it shows ID distinct count in that little tooltip. Well, that's not very useful. So over here on the right, I can go into format and I can change that. I can say deal count, right? I can just make those adjustments on the fly. So now if I look at it, it says deal count instead. I think a lot of people are going to prefer that in my experience. Now we'll click save. Last but not least, we're going to make a dashboard. So a dashboard is a place to put many different reports and charts. So we'll give this a name. Go up here into the top left and we'll click on reports. Now again, anything from across the system, I can bring in here. Even if it has nothing to do with CRM data, I can bring in data from desk, CRM, books, etc. Gets a little funky with your filters if you do that, I will warn you. But if I just want to bring in those things that I created, I can just click and drag them directly in. I can size them up however I'd like them. And then I can click save. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that it sets a user filter for my entire dashboard. And you're like, well, why did it do that? Well, the reason it did that is because inside of my pivot table, I have a user filter. So it's kind of going like, okay, I'm assuming that you're going to want to use those same user filters in the scope of this dashboard because you were using them when you were looking at this just as a report. What you'll also notice is that those user filters behind the scenes are still applying, right? So even though like this filter technically allows closed won and closed lost right now, the reports don't, so it still doesn't show up. That's why I kind of consider them your like hard-coded filters. They're the ones that you use as an admin behind the scenes to set up the dashboard. Now, if I go into Edit Design and click on Stage, I can, in this case, I'll probably want to exclude these values. They're kind of poking their head back in because of the context of the dashboard. So I'm going to click on, Save there. And now we'll get rid of those, right? And just see the ones that we actually care about and not those ones that we know that we're going to exclude. Couple last quick things here. There is a super special timeline filter that only exists on dashboards. Why does this exist? Well, the timeline filter is a way to filter many different dates on the same dashboard, right? Because if you think about this, you might have a pipeline report, and in one case, you want to filter it on closing date of a deal. In another, you want to filter it on created time, right? And these are two different date fields. So I can come in here, I can set up my timeline filter. I can include a variety of different options, right? I can favorite them if I'd like. So let's say like last 6 months or whatever, and click on OK. Now, what it's going to do at first is essentially make a guess. And it's going to go, created time. Why not? Right? What you can do as an admin is click on Edit Design, come into options on each of these reports, and then map your timeline filter. Okay, so this one, it went crazy. It decided we're going to filter this based on the added time of the user related to the deal. And it's like, well, that's obviously not what we want. So I'll just change that over to closing date, right? Maybe that would make a little bit more sense. A lot of this data is old, so it's not showing up there. We'll just go to this year instead. It should show up. And then down below, I'll do the same thing here, right? And I'll come in, this one it grabbed created time and deals. It's like, well, okay, I guess that's fine. And so you will see a bit of that when you're using the timeline filter. I do still recommend using it, right? Because at the end of the day, you're going to have many different types of data that are on here, and being able to just quickly and easily filter it is going to make life a lot easier. Rather than having 10 different date fields across the top that you use for filtering, just use the timeline filter and get everything mapped to those fields. Little bit annoying at first if you had like 20 elements on here. Yeah, you got to just go through one by one and do it. But nonetheless, it is still worth the time. Now, last thing to show on dashboards is you can, of course, add those reports that you've created, those charts and pivots. You can also add things like elements, maybe an image, maybe an embed, a title header, etc. And you can also add things like widgets. So let's say I want to bring in a widget. You thought I had forgotten about that closed won revenue, didn't you? You thought I wasn't going to actually bring it back in, but here it is. So we're going to make a widget. We're going to choose how we want it to look. I'm doing a dial in this case. We're going to do the data column, closed won revenue. And so because I've created this aggregate formula, I can just invoke it here. I can choose to group this by certain things if I want to do a group by owner name or etc. I'm not going to group in this case. We're just going to go for like a team goal or like a team target. Maybe our target is something like $10,000, so I can set that. Max range would be like $15,000, sure. Again, I can apply things like filters here. Technically, I don't need to. I don't need to filter this by stage equals closed won because my aggregate filter is already doing that, right? It's already applied that filter for me. Lastly, I can come in and do settings if I want to have like, certain colors or certain options, just depending on how I want this to look. Sweet. And now we'll close that out and click save. Don't know if we have any closed won revenue from this year. But if we do or have any closed won deals, that revenue will show under this closed won revenue category. So again, widgets are kind of nice for those call outs that you can kind of use throughout there. They are created exclusively in the context of an individual report, so do keep that in mind. But they're a nice way, or an individual dashboard, pardon me, but they are a nice way to essentially deploy those types of unique KPIs and callouts that give a user a quick and easy way to see what's going on with a certain type of parameter. Now, in this case, what we would actually have to do is come in and list all values again in our filter and click save. Because if we're filtering where closed won doesn't exist, well, that's going to apply to the widget as well, right? So we do need to be a little bit careful about that. But if we go ahead and take a look at it with those filters turned on, we can see the types of data that's going to pop in. So it looks like we've closed $60,000 in the last handful of months. With that, I think we're ready to wrap up here for today. As always, be sure to like and subscribe down below if you found the video useful. While you're down there, leave me a comment with what you'd like to see next inside of Zoho Analytics. I'd like to make some more content on this, so I'm really open to input. And last but not least, head on over to Zenatta.com and click on Book a Meeting if you'd like to talk about how we can help set up Zoho for you and your team. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.